Morning. This morning I'm going to read from The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung. This morning I'm going to read from The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung. And I'm reading chapter 2, which is Religion as a Counterbalance to Mass-Mindedness. I'm beginning on page 19. In order to free the fiction of the sovereign state, in other words, the whims of those who manipulate it, from every wholesome restriction, all socio-political movements tending in this direction invariably try to cut the ground from under the religions. For in order to turn the individual into a function of the state, his dependence on anything beside the state must be taken from him. But religion means dependence on and submission to the irrational facts of experience. These do not refer directly to social and physical conditions. They concern far more the individual's psychic attitude. But it is possible to have an attitude to the external conditions of life only when there is a point of reference outside them. The religions give, or claim to give, such a standpoint, thereby enabling the individual to exercise his judgment and his power of decision. They build up a reserve, as it were, against the obvious and inevitable force of circumstances to which everyone is exposed who lives only in the outer world and has no other ground under his feet except the pavement. If statistical reality is the only reality, then it is the sole authority. There is then only one condition, and since no contrary condition exists, judgment and decision are not only superfluous but impossible. Then the individual is bound to be a function of statistics, and hence a function of the state, or whatever the abstract principle of order may be called. Good morning, early morning on a Sunday. The religions, however, teach another authority opposed to that of the world. The doctrine of the individual's dependence on God makes just as high a claim upon him as the world does. It may even happen that the absoluteness of this claim estranges him from the world in the same way he is estranged from himself when he succumbs to the collective mentality. He can forfeit his judgment and power of decision in the former case for the sake of a religious doctrine, quite as much as in the latter. This is the goal the religions openly aspire to. Unless they compromise with the state. When they do, I prefer to call them not religions, but creeds. A creed gives expression to a definite collective belief, whereas the word religion expresses a subjective relationship to certain metaphysical extramundane factors. A creed is a confession of faith intended chiefly for the world at large and is thus an intramundane affair, while the meaning and purpose of religion lie in the relationship of the individual to God, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, or to the path of salvation and liberation, Buddhism. From this basic fact, all ethics is derived, which without the individual's responsibility before God can be called nothing more than conventional morality. Since they are compromises with mundane reality, the creeds have accordingly seen themselves obliged to undertake a progressive codification of their views, doctrines, and customs and in so doing have externalized themselves to such an extent that the authentic religious element in them, the living relationship to and direct confrontation with their extra-mundane point of reference, has been thrust into the background. The denominational standpoint measures the worth and importance of the subjective religious relationship by the yardstick of traditional doctrine, and where this is not so frequent as in Protestantism, one immediately hears talk of pietism, sectarianism, eccentricity, and so forth, as soon as anyone claims to be guided by God's will. A creed coincides with the established church, or, at any rate, forms a public institution whose members include not only true believers, but vast numbers of people who can only be described as indifferent to matters of religion and who belong to it simply by force of habit. Here the difference between a creed and a religion becomes palpable. To the adherent of a creed, therefore, it is not always a religious matter, but more often a social one, and, as such, it does nothing to give the individual any foundation. And as such, it gives nothing to the individual. Let me read that again. And as such, it does nothing to give the individual any foundation. For support, he has to depend exclusively on his relation to an authority which is not of this world. The criterion here is not lip service to a creed, but the psychological fact that the life of the individual is not determined solely by the ego and its opinions or by social factors, but quite as much, if not more, by a transcendent authority. It is not ethical principles, however lofty, or creeds, however orthodox, that lay the foundations for the freedom and autonomy of the individual, but simply and solely the empirical awareness, the incontrovertible experience of an intensely personal, reciprocal relationship between man and an extra-mundane authority which acts as a counterpoise to the world and its, quote, reason, unquote. Now that's an important paragraph, so I'm going to read it one more time. The criterion here is not lip service to a creed, but the psychological fact that the life of the individual is not determined solely by the ego and its opinions or by social factors, but quite as much, if not more, by a transcendent authority. It is not ethical principles, however lofty, or creeds, however orthodox, that lay the foundations for the freedom and autonomy of the individual, but simply and solely the empirical awareness, the incontrovertible experience of an intensely personal, reciprocal relationship between man and an extra-mundane authority, which acts as a counterpoise to the, quote, world, unquote, and its reason. And its, quote, reason, unquote. This formulation will not please either the mass man or the collective believer. For the former, the policy of the state is the supreme principle of thought and action. Indeed, this was the purpose for which he was enlightened, and accordingly the mass man grants the individual a right to exist only insofar as the individual is a function of the state. The believer, on the other hand, while admitting that the state has a moral and factual claim, confesses to the belief that not only man, but the state that rules him is subject to the overlordship of God, and that, in case of doubt, the supreme decision will be made by God and not by the state. Since I do not presume to any metaphysical judgments, I must leave it an open question whether the world, i.e., the phenomenal world of man, and hence nature in general, is the opposite of God or not. I can only point to the fact that the psychological opposition between these two realms of experience is not only vouched for in the New Testament, but is still exemplified very plainly today in the negative attitude of the dictator states to religion and of the church to atheism and materialism. Just as man, as a social being, cannot be the long run, Let me start that one again. Just as man as a social being cannot in the long run exist without a tie to the community, so the individual will never find the real justification for his existence and his own spiritual and moral autonomy anywhere except in an extramundane principle capable of relativizing the overpowering influence of external factors. The individual who is not anchored in God can offer no resistance on his own resources to the The individual who is not anchored in God can offer no resistance on his own resources to the physical and moral blandishments of the world. For this, he needs the evidence of inner, transcendent experience, which alone can protect him from the otherwise inevitable submersion in the mass. Merely intellectual or even moral insight into the stultification and moral irresponsibility of the mass man is a negative recognition only, and amounts to not much more than a wavering on the road to the atomization of the individual. It lacks the driving force of religious conviction, since it is merely rational. The dictator state has one great advantage over bourgeois reason. Along with the individual, it swallows up his religious forces. The state has taken the place of God. That is why, seen from this angle, the socialist dictatorships are religious. That is why, seen from this angle, the socialist dictatorships are religious and state slavery in the form of worship. But the religious function cannot be dislocated and falsified in this way without giving rise to secret doubts, which are immediately repressed so as to avoid conflict with the prevailing trends toward mass-mindedness. The result, as always in such cases, is overcompensation in the form of fanaticism, which in its turn is used as a weapon for stamping out the least flicker of opposition. Free opinion is stifled and moral decision ruthlessly suppressed on the plea that the end justifies the means, even the vilest. The policy of the state is exalted to a creed. The leader or party boss becomes a demigod beyond the leader or party boss becomes a demigod beyond good and evil, and his votaries are honored as heroes, martyrs, apostles, missionaries. There is only one truth, and beside it no other. It is sacrosanct and above criticism. Anyone who thinks differently is a heretic, who, as as we know from history, is threatened with all manner of unpleasant things. Only the party boss who holds the political power in his hands can interpret the state doctrine authentically, and he does so just as suits him. When, through mass rule, the individual becomes social unit number so-and-so, and the state is elevated to the supreme principle, it is only to be expected that the religious function, too, will be sucked into the maelstrom. Religion, as the careful observation and taking account of certain invisible and uncontrollable factors, is an instinctive attitude peculiar to man, and its manifestations can be followed all through human history. Its evident purpose is to maintain the psychic balance, for the natural man has an equally natural knowledge of the fact that his conscious functions may at any time be thwarted by uncontrollable happenings coming from inside as well as from outside. For this reason, he has always taken care that any difficult decisions likely to have consequences for himself and others shall be rendered safe by suitable measures of a religious nature. Offerings are made to the invisible powers, formidable blessings are pronounced, and all kinds of solemn rites are performed. Everywhere and at all times there have been rites d'entrée et de sortie, rites of entry and exit, whose magical efficacy is denied, and which are impugned as magic and superstition by rationalists incapable of psychological insight. But magic has above all a psychological effect whose importance should not be underestimated. The performance of a magical action. The performance of a, quote, magical, unquote, action gives the person concerned a feeling of security which is absolutely essential for carrying out a decision, because a decision is inevitably somewhat one-sided and is therefore rightly felt to be a risk. Even a dictator thinks it necessary not only to accompany his acts of state with threats, but to stage them with all manner of solemnities. Brass bands, flags, banners, parades, and monster demonstrations are no different in principle from ecclesiastical processions, cannonades, and fireworks to scare off demons. Only the suggestive parade of state power engenders a collective feeling of security which, unlike religious demonstrations, gives the individual no protection against his inner demonism. Hence he will cling all the more to the power of the state, i.e., to the mass, thus delivering himself up to it physically as well as morally, and putting the finishing touch to his social depotentiation. The state, like the church, demands enthusiasm, self-sacrifice, and love, and if religion requires or presupposes the fear of God, then the dictator state takes good care to provide the necessary terror. When the rationalist directs the main force of his attack against the magical effect of the rite as asserted by tradition, he has in reality completely missed the mark. The essential point, the psychological effect, is overlooked, although both parties make use of it for directly opposite purposes. A similar situation prevails with regard to their respective conceptions of the goal. The goals of religion, deliverance from evil, reconciliation with God, rewards in the hereafter, and so on, turn into worldly promises about freedom from care for one's daily bread, the just distribution of material goods, universal prosperity in the future, and shorter working hours, that the fulfillment of these promises is as far off as paradise, only furnishes yet another analogy and underlines the fact that the masses have been converted from an extra mundane goal to a purely worldly belief, which is extolled with exactly the same religious fervor and exclusiveness that the creeds display in the other direction. In order not to repeat myself unnecessarily, I shall not enumerate all the parallels between worldly and otherworldly beliefs, but shall content myself with emphasizing the fact that the natural function which has existed from the beginning, like the religious function, cannot be disposed of with rationalistic and so-called enlightened criticism. You can, of course, represent the doctrinal contents of the creeds as impossible and subject them to ridicule, but such methods miss the point and do not hit the religious function which forms the basis of the creeds. Religion, in the sense of conscientious regard for the irrational factors of the psyche and individual fate, reappears, evilly distorted in the deification of the state and the dictator. You can throw out nature with a pitchfork, but she'll always turn up again. The leaders and dictators, having weighed up the situation correctly, are therefore doing their best to gloss over the all too obvious parallel with the deification of Caesar, and to hide their real power behind the fiction of the state, though this, of course, alters nothing. There's a footnote here. Since this essay was written in the spring of 1956, there has been a noticeable reaction in the USSR to this objectionable state of affairs. Okay, and even this was published probably 50 or 60 years ago. Anyway, going on. As I have already pointed out, the dictator state, besides robbing the individual of his rights, has also cut the ground from under his feet physically by depriving him of the metaphysical foundations of his existence. The ethical decision of the individual human being no longer counts. What alone matters is the blind movement of the masses, and the lie has thus become the operative principle of political action. The state has drawn the logical conclusions from this, as the existence of many millions of state slaves completely deprived of all rights mutely testifies. Both the dictator state and the denominational religion lay quite particular emphasis on the idea of community. This is the basic idea of communism, and it is thrust down the throats of the people so much that it has the exact opposite of the desired effect. It inspires divisive mistrust. The church, which is no less emphasized, appears on the other side as a communal ideal, and where the church is notoriously weak, as in Protestantism, the hope of or belief in a communal experience makes up for the painful lack of cohesion. As can easily be seen, community is an indispensable aid in the organization of masses and is therefore a two-edged weapon. Just as the addition of however many zeros will never make a unit, so the value of a community depends on the spiritual and moral state. So the value of a community depends on the spiritual and moral stature of the individuals composing it. For this reason, one cannot expect from the community any effect that would outweigh the suggestive influence of the environment, that is, a real and fundamental change in individuals, whether for good or for bad. Such changes can come only from the personal encounter between man and man, but not from communistic or Christian baptisms en masse, which do not touch the inner man. How superficial the effect of communal propaganda actually is can be seen from recent events in Eastern Europe. The communal idea reckons without its host, overlooking the individual human being, who in the end will assert his claim. Okay, so when he's referring to events in Eastern Europe, this sentence was added in January 1957, so immediately after the Hungarian Revolution. So I'll just read the end of that again so that you understand the context. How superficial the effect of communal propaganda actually is can be seen from recent events in Eastern Europe. The communal ideal reckons without its host, overlooking the individual human being, who in the end will assert his claim. Okay. So that is the end of chapter 2. And I will go on with chapter 3 perhaps tomorrow. But if you have any comments, I'll be happy to take them now. Otherwise, I will move on with my day. We have a busy day today. My mother-in-law was given movie tickets to see The Favorite today, and so we're going to go see that, and then at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we will be watching the Army-Navy game, which is a family tradition in my family. So, anyway, moving on. Thank you for joining me today.